Poland's there weren't. It was an especially festive night. Stanisław had finally finished his darling, Poland's Fizzled Histories. This could not appear only in their journal with its modest readership, but had to come out in a national publication, an important weekly that published the writings of only those who'd already made names for themselves. But Stanisław was, even now, still unsure of himself and wanted the work to have an open dress rehearsal, a final run-through, so all of Portia's big names were gathered together for the occasion. Wanda had baked a cake, and they'd stocked up on wine. At the beginning, Zawisza tried to lower everyone's expectations. "We're not getting started immediately," he said, happily nervous. "We'll wait for the dusk. This isn't a story you hear in the daylight. All right. Somebody open a bottle of wine." This time, they'd gathered at Wanda's, even though HQ had moved to Arkadiusz's studio a good while ago. But it seemed to the author that gathering in a typical workshop smelling of turpentine would be improper. No! They needed a warm, human room in which everything wasn't temporary and hopeless. The guests were Arkadiusz, Adam, Wanda, Liliana, both Julias, and a young boy who had a very red face coated in pimples and gigantic blonde locks that would have made any rock star jealous. He was frightfully eager to help, pouring coffee and bringing people their mugs, and he was striking in his ability to bungle every service he offered. Coffee splattered out of the pitcher onto the new tablecloth with a big foaming splosh. Never mind that the tablecloth wasn't white and wasn't starched, but it was no more than one of Wanda's bandanas. He got the coffee into the mug somehow, and then walked so carefully across the room with it that everyone held their breath. Now! It'll happen now! And it happened. The young man moved his hand for a moment, and some of the coffee speckled somebody's socks. "Oi! I'll bring you a new one. I'm so sorry." His hands, which couldn't hold fast to anything, were small and soft, and he had bright pink palms and tiny filthy nails. The boy's surname was Bioe, like the Silesian prince, and it's likely that nobody actually knew his first name. He offered to light all the girls' cigarettes, and the ladies waited politely until he actually managed to light them. They'd have done it more quickly themselves, of course. Bioe fumbled around in his pockets, fat with crap, until finally pulling out some tattered matches, only to break them a couple of times or have a flame go out. But eventually the gallant gesture was finished, and it was actually healthier this way. The lighting ritual took so long that you smoked less. He always offered to open wine bottles, wash dishes, and even helped people with their coats, both when they came in or as they left, which made him an extremely amusing and very welcome addition to the group. The boy was short, broad-shouldered, a bit thick-set, and dressed like Chaplin's tramp. Dress trousers so worn that they shined, with the creases surviving only above the shoes, and shoelaces that were always undone, so it was a miracle that he didn't trip over them. Bioe might have been about 16, but he was much smarter than his age implied, and he drank 2 men's worth of vodka. He spilled some too, of course. Flitting around between the attendees was still one more peculiar chap. Samuel Orliński was an intellectual who lived in internal exile. He didn't crave public attention, but mixed only with a restricted, chosen set. His habit was to live entirely in shadow, nobody even knew where, and then appear a couple of times a month at the private events of very different circles, where everybody knew him and greeted him as their own. Naturally, he was directly acquainted with all of Portia's members, and no one really remembered when this acquaintance began. It was also unclear where he got his information about soirees, but you could be sure that if a very exclusive party was happening somewhere, Samuel would be there. No ifs, ands, or buts. In addition, he always knew when a friend had a gallery opening, or when they published a poetry collection, or when they had a concert. No one had to invite him. Orliński was there, and he always had his own drink. He was thin and veiny, with dry, delicate skin, and his face, which glowed slightly red and had nice, sharp features, was pulled into thick, dry furrows, as if his skin was one size too small for such a lively range of expression. His shoulders were bent slightly forward, and his upper back hunched, while his hands dangled uselessly at his sides like extraneous oars. He spoke unbelievably quickly and fitfully, half laughing, and he had a heart-warming way of showing his sincere joy upon meeting anyone at all. He embraced a person fervently, as if just that person had been missing from his full happiness for all that time, as if just that person were totally special and extremely precious because he, Samuel, could discern exactly what was what. Everybody brightened when Orlinsky appeared like heat lightning. There was a great flash of light and heat, and a cloud of ozone burst into the air, and then he'd gone, and no one would see him again for some time, as if he didn't exist at all. The blue hour had descended over Warsaw. The sky above the houses was the pale yellow of semolina pudding, and the higher you looked, the darker and bluer it got. Indeed, exactly like semolina pudding with blueberry kissel soaking in. Suliswaf went around Vanda's apartment lighting candles. They killed the lights, and the buzz quieted. "Adam," Suliswaf said, "you read. You read so slowly and thoroughly that you can think over every word." And Adam read. It was a complicated text, dripping with mythology and pathetic passages, a stunning vision on an epic scale of what might have been. It didn't mock or ridicule, but searched for links between yearning and reality, the actual and the fantastical. It tried to settle and to mediate settlement, gently touching the gaps and the painful conclusions to which usual historical writing brings us. Suliswaf's philosophical prose poem was indisputably beautiful, but it operated on such strange and, for Poland, such foreign categories, that it was well beyond the grasp of common sense. Lost somewhere inside himself, Suliswaf listened intently to the form his idea had taken. Sometimes he interrupted Adam as he read, saying, "Replace that word with this one, please," or "Let's change that, it didn't sound nice." At times he seemed to wake up and probe his listeners' faces. "How is it? Is it getting across?" he thought to himself. He'd staked so much on this. And then Adam said the final words. "We must learn to dream." The story ended, and the lights came back on. People stood up and congratulated Suliswaf on a grand, electrifying work. His excited listeners started to bomb each other with astute analysis. "Look how the text goes off somewhere and doesn't ever come back. Or actually, how it takes everything in the here and now along, so it's as if there's no need to come back. That's exactly the kind of thing writing has to do. Only a few good writers can say things in just the right way to delight and elevate the reader. If we can't step over the line that divides utopia from reality, we can still inject reality with dreams, give it tiny, tiny doses of possibility." Suliswaf simply glowed. He'd been expounding this idea on paper for over a year, and carried it in his head for longer than he could remember. Only one of the attendees, a not especially cool girl, whose facial structure would have made her a good model for Yurge's Metamorphoses drawings, made stupid comparisons. Perfectly innocently, she blurted out the first allusion that had popped into her head. "That story about the fairy king brings to mind the journeys of Panclex, right? Wasn't there a king in the fantasy land who'd run out of ink for some reason? And the person who became the king was the man who wrote the most beautiful fairy tale. They sent Panclex all over the world to look for a new supply of ink, on land, under water, but he didn't find any, so to keep from losing his honour, he turned himself into ink. Listening to this fairy tale, I had this vivid image of a big, hefty ink bottle, with Suliswaf Zawisza's head as the imaginary cork." Even the long-lost Theophil reacted to the essay once it had appeared in a big weekly. He came by the editorial board to offer his words of thanks. "Really beautiful, sad implication. It's inspiring to see ideas you wouldn't come up with yourself, but the form is even wilder. It's a punch in the mug. Bewitchingly, fantastically realistic descriptions. Please accept this honour from a member of the inbred clique. Suliswaf, you're the best tableau vivant word painter I've ever met." Suliswaf reacted to the praise with modesty and firmness, citing the fact that a great part of this kind of effusiveness is one of the world's best-known forms of creative denigration. At an art opening, does one not typically hear things like, "Oh, how nice, I like what you do with colours, cool pink tones," or other such rot? But here, my friends, you can really see what an artist is getting at. It's truly inherent to the work. I'm just delighted by that. But anyway, if a group doesn't bring along some power, a domain, you know, you can barely call it a coterie. Because it's only natural that friends praise friends. When praising each other had gotten out of hand at Porsche, you knew everything was all right. Everybody just works, and things swim along. This mostly happens in the fall after the oppressively hot summer break. Everybody buzzes graciously over absolutely any contribution that gets tossed onto the table. What distinguishes this kind of sycophancy from the normal waxing poetic? It's honest. If it's good, they say so. If it's very good, everybody is head over heels. If it's weak, there's no tactful silence about its failings. Thus, the good accumulates and the bad is rooted out. It really works when some dissident, some contrary dog appears, and everyone can form a united front and bark together. Nice, isn't it? But that's only nice so long as you're with your own. Naturally, all other groups are dynasties that use their connections to boost each other. The writer's top nest, the ZLP house, had the slightly derisive name of the Cottage on Krakowski-Przeźmiersza Street, because although they were always up to something over there, it wasn't clear that anyone else had any interest at all. Some important poet published a collection, so they had a party they called an opening. ZLP sprung for your seating and your wine, somebody read a couple of poems for appearances, and the listeners, who were, naturally, the writer's friends and acquaintances, as well as two older ladies who went to every event in Warsaw, fidgeted impatiently and waited for the official part of the evening to end. It was basically the same as an apartment party, only the union paid for it and the union also owned the space. So, can you really blame them? They needed their own little recognition too, wine, pats on the back. They derided and mocked those who weren't in their little gang. But why? And why only them? And why do only they get to meet with readers? And why only their stuff in the newspapers? And why do only they get to write reviews? Well, you try to be a functionary writer. Organise morning events for children and reading groups for seniors. You see how sweet it is. Did you notice how the word dream conjugates? As in dreamed versus dreamt. By comparison, dreamed seems to take on more of an ominous winter night shade, no? Something long and dim, wondered little Yulia. But it also seems like an editorial iceberg has just driven over the text and turned it into the Eastern European plain. This version, the one that'll go to Marcia, there's some sweat, some bitterness, wrestling with words. But this newspaper version... Maybe I love that sharpness too much, that discernible real feeling, however fantastical it may be to imagine. It's exactly the description's clinical precision that makes it impossible to hide the rising world under dreams and visions. But newspaper readers didn't think so at all. On the contrary, the reactions were moronic. Generally, people thought that the young man was just blathering, and the phrase, "I didn't understand a thing," was repeated like a mantra. He was a narcissist, or then people started saying that it was a real history, and when they compared the "where it went" vision with what was, they didn't find much of a difference. One thought that a poet should stick to poetry and not start sermonizing. Damn blathering pontification. Does this guy understand this himself? Or the occasional wordsmith, by his own estimation, thought, long and rambling like the Polish epic Pan Tadeusz, or the last foray into Lithuania. You start with the thrill, what will come of this? But nothing comes of it. Like a wind had rattled the door, and you go to look, who's there? But good luck catching the wind. Many beautiful, complex words set in a line with a rhythm that would be, but also is not, without the slightest meaning. Or if there was, it was known only to the author. Meaningless, all of it, Stanisław derided. From then on, he preferred to only give direction, and not to write himself. If occasionally an article of his popped up on the editorial desk, it generally did not deal in personal utopias and narratives, but revealed to us the peculiar thoughts of men of the past. Once, Zawisza was so fed up with human folly that he plumbed even prehistory, before the appearance of the deplorable race of men. And as he examined those ages, he could think about how much of the world was already fucked long ago.